When a small-town Oregon teen vanishes on her way to her after-school job, thorough searches prove fruitless and investigators suspect foul play. Multiple potential suspects arise in a heartbreaking search for the truth in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
A quick heads up, this episode contains mention of sexual assault. We won't go into any graphic detail, but still, please listen with care. Joan Hall, who went by Joanie, was last seen alive on September 30th, 1983. She was 17 years old at the time and lived in Warrenton, Oregon. Warrenton is a small coastal town that sits on the water in the northwesternmost part of the state and is home to a few thousand people. Joanie lived there with her parents and siblings. Their family was large and close-knit. She was one of 6 kids and had other family, cousins, aunts, and uncles, etc. in town as well. Joanie was a high school senior and was known as a quiet, conscientious, and ambitious girl. On the day of her disappearance, a Friday, after finishing the school day, she had plans to meet up with her aunt and help her with her work. Her aunt was a local third-grade teacher, and Joanie, herself a straight-A student, planned to walk from the high school to the elementary school where she would help grade papers and tutor kids who needed some extra help with their schoolwork. This was something Joanie did regularly, and she loved kids, so as far as she was concerned, this would be a very enjoyable way to spend a Friday afternoon. Plus, it didn't hurt that her aunt had promised to take her shopping afterward.
I mean, even before you get to that, it's sweet and just nice to see people having that bond with their family.
Joanie's family was, by all accounts, a very nice family, and she was a very nice girl. So Joanie left the high school at approximately 2:10 that afternoon, slightly early to make it there on time to tutor the third-grade students. The distance between the high school and the elementary school was about a mile, or approximately 1.6 kilometers. To her aunt's surprise, though, Joanie never arrived at the elementary school. And her aunt wasn't the only one to notice her absence that afternoon. Her immediate family members, including one of her brothers and her mom, noticed when she failed to return home later in the afternoon. And this was very unlike Joanie. This was long before everyone was carrying a cell phone around in their pocket, but nonetheless, Joanie would always find a phone and call to let her family know if she wasn't going to make it home on time for some reason. She would never just leave them hanging. Joanie's brother, Chuck, tried to imagine where she might have gone and figured it was worth looking for her at the local high school football game, so he went and searched for her. When he couldn't find her, he approached a local police officer and told him that his sister hadn't come home from school that day. The officer helped him look for Joanie going through the crowd at the game, but neither of them had any luck. Meanwhile, back at home, Joanie's mom, Mary Jane, called local law enforcement to report Joanie missing. When local deputies began their investigation, they quickly learned that Joanie, who didn't have a car of her own, had been given a ride from the high school to a convenience store in downtown Warrenton directly after school. So she had not left the high school on foot. According to reporting for the Daily Astorian, Joanie's friend, a boy named Mike Moore, dropped her off at the mini-mart, and she reportedly told him that she was going to buy a soda and walk the rest of the way, about a mile, to the elementary school. Where she actually went from there, though, and how, remains unknown. The unexplained disappearance of a high schooler, or anyone for that matter, was not a common occurrence in Warrenton. So, local police convened a task force, which included members of multiple law enforcement agencies and search and rescue professionals, and they met 3 times a day, with the goal being to locate Joanie. According to the Daily Astorian, the task force consisted of 6 investigators, a legal advisor, an information officer, a coordinator, a search team of 12 to 50 officers, and a reserve search team approximately 250 people strong. The task force searched local trails, roads, fields, and waterways, anywhere and everywhere, thoroughly searching the kind of forested wilderness that characterizes a Pacific Northwest logging town like Warrenton is anything but easy, but they put in earnest effort for 11 days. After that, the Clatsop County Sheriff called off the search, stating that they'd run out of leads to pursue. As part of the search, investigators had also canvassed the town, going door to door in an attempt to glean information about Joanie's disappearance. Information had turned out to be hard to come by, however. The convenience store clerk who'd been working when Joanie had entered the store told investigators that Joanie had purchased a Coke and had then left the store on foot, just like she'd told her friend Mike that she'd planned to do. So, investigators canvassed the neighborhood around the convenience store, looking for people who might have seen which direction Joanie had gone in when she'd left the store on the afternoon of her disappearance. However, they received conflicting reports. A Lieutenant Loffman from the Clatsop County Sheriff's Department spoke to journalist Leslie Fornes 5 days into the search, stating that, quote, "We have a lot of maybes and mights, but nothing substantial," end quote. He went on to explain that Joanie's disappearance was truly unusual and that they did not believe that she was a runaway. She had close bonds with her family, performed exceptionally well in school, and excelled in her extracurricular activities. There was nothing to suggest that she was anything other than a happy, responsible, well-cared-for, and well-adjusted young woman. On this note, though, it's certainly worth mentioning that according to what Joanie's sister, Becky, told the Daily Astorian in 2013, for the first 3 days after Joanie's disappearance, investigators actually did think that Joanie was a runaway and told Becky as much, which, understandably, greatly frustrated her.
Yeah, when you're in this kind of situation, that's definitely not what you want to hear. And it's really not the best way to approach this kind of situation when you're dealing with a juvenile that's gone missing, that does seem to have a good home life.
Yeah.
The possibility of foul play being involved is much higher.
Definitely.
And the risk that foul play brings is also much greater than dealing with a runaway. So I think it's always best to err on the side of caution and treat it like foul play may be involved and investigate from that standpoint.
Yeah, I'll say this. Am I surprised that they tried to feed this theory to the family in 1983 about a 17-year-old girl? No. But I will tell you from receiving countless missing persons reports in my own work, when a teenager runs away, the family almost always knows and will tell you that that's what occurred. It is extremely unusual for a teenager to run away and for their family to genuinely have no clue what happened or where they went.
Honestly, when we're talking about the time frame of this, I'm surprised they did anything in the first 24 hours because that's my constant complaint with law enforcement.
Well, at the very least, we had that police officer who helped her brother, Chuck, look around the football game. Now, back to Becky's statement that she gave to the Daily Astorian, she told them that the then Clatsop County Sheriff, Sheriff Eastman, and one of his deputies, a Deputy Gerald Bosch, seemed annoyed by her questions and concern about her sister's disappearance in those first 3 days. And we'll talk more about those men here shortly, but just know that she says they brushed her off. Also know that, obviously, they eventually changed their tune and came to believe that Joanie had almost certainly been the target of some misfortune, very possibly foul play. So they pulled out all the stops, searching for her heavily. Reportedly, every lead they received was explored. Meanwhile, Joanie's family had been plunged into a nightmare that few of us can imagine. Her disappearance was so stressful that her dad's heart literally could not take it. Just 4 days after she vanished, he suffered a heart attack.
The grief level here is immense. And honestly, pulling out all of the stops 3 days late isn't really pulling out all the stops. It's
right.
A lot of missed effort and missed information.
The amount of stress her parents must have been under just had to have been unfathomable. Now, fortunately, he did survive that heart attack. But even after he was back home and on his feet, the heartache of living with a missing child remained. Neither of Joanie's parents would ever be the same, and their surviving children say that their health began an irreversible decline when Joanie disappeared. One of the leads investigators initially received came from 3 local teen boys, all high school seniors like Joanie, who said that they'd seen Joanie on the afternoon of her disappearance in the driveway of one of their houses. However, they later changed their story, saying that actually it had been another girl they'd seen. Of course, one of the possibilities investigators looked into was that the boy who'd given Joanie a ride to the convenience store, Mike Moore, might also have offered her a ride to the elementary school. There were no witnesses who might have seen her leave with him, at least not that I could find in the reporting that I read through, which was all of it. But given that he had driven her there, it seemed like a logical avenue of thought.
You can't disregard the last acquaintance that she was familiar with that knew her and that was talking to her and interacting with her and gave her a ride.
Right, that person is always going to be a person of focus in an investigation like this.
Unfortunately for them, it could be an innocent encounter, but statistical likelihood is too significant to discount.
Right. Now, of course, this is an unsolved case. Mike Moore was never charged with any crime in relation to her disappearance, and to the best of my knowledge, no solid evidence ever arose to implicate him. And according to the reporting I read, those who knew him say that they really struggled to imagine him hurting Joanie. Now, of course, the same could be said for the friends, family, and acquaintances of countless people who have committed terrible violent crimes. Often, we don't know people as well as we might think.
No, I mean, we've had this conversation before. I think people's remorse or lack thereof is a big indicator of how they interact. Like, if they do truly have some remorse, those are the people that the family members are like, yeah, I totally could have seen this coming. But people without that remorse, they're very good at hiding it. And some of those people, you'll never know what they are capable of.
Right, some people are very adept at hiding what they're capable of. Now, speaking of Joanie's classmates, there was another one, a boy named Ernie Brown, who approached investigators early on with a lead. He told them that he'd seen Joanie leave the convenience store with a boy that she'd identified as her boyfriend.
Okay, that's definitely concerning.
Yeah, it was surprising because Joanie, as far as anyone knew, did not have a boyfriend. Ernie felt like police didn't take him seriously, which frustrated him. Even so, decades later, he has stuck to his story, recounting it to a journalist for the Daily Astorian, which published a piece in honor of the 30th anniversary of Joanie's disappearance in 2013. Ernie seemed very eager to tell his story, and here's what he says he saw. On the afternoon of Joanie's disappearance, Ernie had just pulled into the convenience store's parking lot when Joanie walked out of the store's front door. As she exited, Ernie asked her whether she needed a ride.
Okay.
At that point, he says another young man stepped out of a nearby car that had just pulled into the lot and parked near the doors. That young man, who Ernie described as having blonde curls along with a skinny build and a rat face, glared at Ernie. Meanwhile, Joanie's face lit up as she saw the blonde guy, and she told Ernie, "No, that's my boyfriend." She then climbed into the blonde guy's car, which Ernie, who loves cars, described as a black Dodge Polara. Ernie claims that he never saw the car, the boy, or, of course, Joanie again, but that the blonde guy's face haunts his dreams. His words. In 2013, he told the Daily Astorian, quote, "He had a really narrow face, like a rat face. He was 5'6" to 5'7", end quote. Ernie's account is pretty detailed, and it's clearly something that he's still emotionally invested in. But is it accurate?
So there's a lot of details there. There's a lot of comments that make me think that it's definitely emotionally charged, obviously.
It is, to an extent that seems to surprise me a bit, 30 years after the fact.
It's almost too detailed, I think.
That's what I thought as well.
Something just feels off about this.
I felt the same way, and it's kind of hard to pinpoint it. I think maybe for me, it's the emotional way he describes the guy, almost as if it's not someone he just glimpsed once, but someone he had something against with his rat face.
Yes.
And the line about it haunting his dreams, it all just seems a little over the top. Now, I could be wrong, and maybe this happened, and Ernie is the only person on the earth that witnessed any of it. And if that's the case, I'm sorry, Ernie, but to me, this doesn't feel right.
It feels like a statement of jealousy.
It does. Like, here I was going to gallantly give this beautiful young woman a ride when old Ratty McRatface jumped out of his stupid Dodge Polara.
Yeah. Even the Dodge Polara, that's a pretty obscure car. I mean, part of me's like, was he jealous of this vehicle? What did he drive at the time? What was his physical appearance at the time? Why doesn't anybody else have any other comments about who this person was also?
Right. It seems off. But, nonetheless, it's a theory. It was detailed in a really good article I read on the piece. I thought I'd mention it. Now, to the best of my knowledge, no one else saw this blonde guy, and no one had any knowledge of Joanie having a boyfriend, rat-faced or otherwise. And if this guy did exist and Joanie was dating him, she'd apparently kept that secret from everyone in the world, including a cousin who she considered to be her best friend, except for Ernie.
Also pushing this is, why did she need a ride from somebody else to the convenience store if her boyfriend was going to magically meet her there or be there?
Also, how did he know she was there? There's a lot of questions.
Yeah, we're missing something.
Right. Now, for the record, Ernie says that he too was surprised to learn that Joanie had a boyfriend. He'd never noticed her with any boy before and was struck by how excited she seemed to be to see the blonde guy that day. He says that she is lit up like a Christmas tree, which again reeks a bit of jealousy to me. Also, for the record, Ernie's theory is that Joanie ran away to start a new life with her boyfriend. Again, though, investigators do not believe that Joanie ran away, and frankly, neither do I.
Right now, I'm much more interested as Ernie as a suspect than I would be for her running away. It goes back to the thing about sometimes people interject themselves into a case or provide mysterious information to cases to be part of it.
When they're actually the suspect, right?
All the emotionally charged statements and the features that he has given to this rat face, it really does speak to me like it might be him covering something up.
I had that thought as well. Now, this is the only mention I've ever read of Ernie in the large amount of materials I read on this case was that one article 30 years after the fact where he came in to tell his little story. So I have no idea if he was ever considered a suspect in this case. No idea. Now, sometimes there are also people who insert themselves into investigations with made-up stories just because they want to feel a part of something important and exciting. I've seen that before as well, so that could be all that it is. Now, for whatever it may be worth, that's Ernie's theory. Now, let's move on to another theory. This one involves several other boys that went to school with Joanie, the ones we mentioned a short while ago. So, one day at Joanie's school, a police officer took charge of the intercom and used it to tell the entire school that he wanted to speak to anyone who knew anything about Joanie's disappearance. A student named Jim Sears then walked to the office where he told the officer that he'd seen Joanie on the afternoon that she'd gone missing. Specifically, he'd seen her between 4 and 4:30 p.m., which is nearly 2 hours past when she'd purchased that Coke at the convenience store. Jim said that he'd seen her at his own home. He claimed that she and Mike Moore, that's the boy who gave her a ride to the convenience store, had stopped by. Mike Moore, he claimed, had gotten his hands greasy working on his car, and he'd stopped by Jim's house to wipe the grease off of his hands. And Jim had not been the only one to allegedly witness this. He'd been with two friends, boys named Gary Lear and Michael Bosch, not to be confused with Mike Moore, when Mike Moore and Joanie had allegedly stopped by. Jim told the investigator that Gary Lear and Michael Bosch, who was a deputy's son, by the way, would back up his story. And they did, at first. Now, later, all three boys changed their story, claiming that it had not been Joanie with Mike Moore at all, but rather a girl named Teresa, another classmate of theirs. Now, these boys were familiar with both girls' appearances. They went to a small school in a small town with both of them. They all knew each other. So whether the boys really saw either of them, I have no idea. Their change of story is pretty baffling. According to the Daily Astoria, the original police report for this case notes the boys' shifting stories. On one page, the words "statement changed" are underlined, and an investigator has written in large letters, "Why?" Clearly, the boys' abrupt change of story was just as puzzling to investigators as it sounds to us now. Frankly, it seems suspicious, and so do a couple of other details we need to discuss. As I mentioned, one of the boys, Michael Bosch, again, not to be confused with Mike Moore, was the son of a local deputy, Deputy Gerald Bosch, who had been with the Clatsop County Sheriff's Office for approximately 3 years at that point. He was pretty new to law enforcement. And Deputy Bosch had personally interviewed him, his own son, regarding what he'd seen that afternoon, and he'd also interviewed his son's friend, Gary Lear.
Okay, that's a massive conflict right there.
Yes, obviously, that's inappropriate. An impartial third party or parties should have been the only ones permitted to interview Michael Bosch and his friends. After all, can we blindly trust a parent to impartially interview their child in relation to a potential violent crime, and to accurately convey any results that may not look favorable toward their child?
Absolutely not.
Right, of course not.
I mean, even to that point, there's a lot of times where if you have any kind of relationship to a victim or a witness, you shouldn't even be touching anything in the case or even looking up case reports or any of that, because it's
Right, of course.
clearly such a drastic conflict and there's such a potential for influencing things.
Right. This would not and should not be allowed at the vast majority of law enforcement agencies. But it happened. And for the record, not only did Deputy Bosch interview his own child, he didn't even note in his report that it was his child or that they were related.
Okay, red flags all over the place. This is beyond inappropriate.
Yeah. On this note, there actually was a presumably impartial third party who also participated in interviewing Michael Bosch and his friends. That third party was the Warrenton Chief of Police, Chief Humphreys. And guess what, Scott?
I'm guessing that he didn't mention any of this and allowed it to continue, and he has some relation to one of the other kids that was interviewed.
Sorry, that's not the direction I was going. I was going to say that apparently the boys didn't tell Chief Humphreys anything about Teresa. In fact, they apparently didn't change their story at all. As far as Humphreys' report is concerned, the boys saw Joanie that day. It was only Deputy Bosch who had allegedly been given a different story by the boys.
I don't know, go on Amazon and order The Biggest Red Flag You Have, because Deputy Bosch, beyond being inappropriate and somebody that should not be allowed in law enforcement, in my opinion, he is somebody that is beyond questionable.
Right. I don't know whether the boys actually changed their story on their own or whether this was something that he fabricated, to be honest with you.
His entire character has to be in question right now, and his credibility as an officer.
Yeah. Now, on top of that, there are a couple of other things worth knowing about Michael Bosch, the son of Deputy Bosch. Firstly, he was a member of the Clatsop County Sheriff's Office's Explorers Program, a program designed to help youth explore possible future careers in law enforcement. We've talked about this program at length in a past episode on the death of Sandra Birchmore, but this program exists at sheriff offices throughout the country, so this was a local chapter of that. And you know who else was a member? Joanie. She was interested in potentially becoming a police officer. Had she ever gotten the chance, she probably would have made an excellent officer. She had a passion for helping kids, like the children she tutored. She was responsible, and she was known to have a strong ethical compass. Anyway, both she and Michael Bosch had run for president of the club, and the day before Joanie's disappearance, the votes had been tallied. Joanie had won the vote. This made her the president of the Explorers Club, its first ever female president, by the way.
I mean, this obviously paints a motive, it paints jealousy, it paints every red flag you want, and then you've got the father getting involved and engaged in the investigation and honestly tampering with the investigation, in my opinion.
It's all very concerning.
Yeah, there's no way of getting around this. It's all stuff that needs to be investigated by a state agency or a larger agency at this point.
Hasn't happened, by the way, but it would be great. So, Joanie disappeared less than 24 hours after defeating Michael in that election. And of course, this may seem like a pretty petty motive for possible murder, and perhaps it is. But we're talking about kids here, and kids can sometimes be petty. For that matter, people, period, including adults, can be pretty petty.
I can only imagine that his father was embarrassed that his son lost.
To a girl? I've had that thought myself. Now, what he was thinking, I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me, especially not in 1983. But there's something else, something more serious that you should know about Michael Bosch. Michael moved out of state, relocating to California just a few days after Joanie's disappearance. His dad, who he had been living with in Oregon, did not move with him. He stayed there and continued to work for the sheriff's office and to be involved in the investigation. Meanwhile, his son, Michael Bosch, it would seem, was sent away to where public records suggest that his mom lived at the time. And he didn't come back.
I mean, you just, I don't know, paint a red flag on the moon at this point.
As we know, moving soon after a murder is common behavior in killers. Therefore, this could, like you said, be considered a lunar red flag. It certainly catches my attention and raises my suspicions. And naturally, it makes me wonder, was Michael Bosch involved in Joanie's disappearance? Were his friends involved as well? Were they all three, along perhaps even with Michael Moore, involved? Given what we know, these are natural questions. However, with that being said, without more information, we can't truly know Deputy Bosch's true motivation for sending his son away. I say this in part because there are some other people and theories we need to discuss. And one of the most compelling alternative theories is also tied to the Clatsop County Sheriff's Office in a big way. More on that next. And now, back to Joanie's story. After 17-year-old Joanie Hall vanished one afternoon in small-town Oregon, a massive search was launched. Despite those efforts, no trace of her was found, and investigators began to suspect foul play. When investigators interviewed local people of interest, their investigative efforts were hindered by some alleged witnesses shifting or telling contradictory stories. It was a frustrating investigation, and decades later, there are multiple theories regarding what may have happened to Joanie. One of those theories involves a classmate of Joanie's who would later go on to commit shocking crimes. His name was Teok Eastman, and like Joanie, he was a student at Astoria High School. He was also a member of the Clatsop County Sheriff's Office Explorers Program, a program, like we said, designed to help youth explore possible future careers in law enforcement. And again, as we said, Joanie also was a participant in the Explorers Program. In fact, at the time of her disappearance, she was the newly appointed president of the club. She had literally been elected president, the club's first ever female president, the day before her disappearance. So, Teok Eastman, who by the way was the son of the then current Clatsop County Sheriff himself, definitely knew Joanie. And Teok Eastman, by all accounts, was a creep. Now, Teok Eastman's peers described him as spooky and odd, and not in a fun or endearing way. And they weren't just picking on him when they said those things. If anything, they were perhaps phrasing things politely. Within a couple years of Joanie's disappearance, Teok Eastman would go on to be involved in violent crimes, including the murder of a teenage girl. Here's what happened. 15-year-old Doreen Ratterman was riding her bike from her home in Clatsop County to nearby Delray Beach during the summer of 1987, so 4 years after Joanie's disappearance, when she encountered two men at the beach. Those two men were 25-year-old Teok Eastman and 20-year-old Anthony Mullins, who had recently moved to the area from San Francisco. Eastman and Mullins worked together as dishwashers at a local restaurant and were dating each other. On that day, they'd been hanging out in Eastman's car, drinking beer and talking. Then they saw Doreen pedaling by. They ambushed her, sexually assaulted her, and fatally strangled her. Then they hid her body. The details of who exactly did what are perhaps unclear. Eastman has claimed that Mullins was the one who had actually grabbed, sexually assaulted, and killed Doreen, strangling her with a wallet chain. He claims to have languished in the car, apparently unbothered by the murder of a child unfolding right outside as Mullins did all of those things. Mullins, however, has described it differently, painting a picture in which he and Eastman worked together to murder Doreen. According to reporting for the Seaside Signal, Mullins told investigators that he and Eastman worked together to carry Doreen, at that point still alive, into some dunes, and that Eastman held Doreen down while Mullins fatally strangled her with a wallet chain. As for who really did what, well, I don't think we'll ever know.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can definitely see the line being drawn that it was probably both of them.
Right, they were both clearly involved.
He doesn't really have a strong defense here.
Yeah, this kind of thing, two co-offenders turning on each other and trying to shift the majority of the blame to the other, it's very common.
I'm more inclined to believe Mullins' side because he didn't completely omit himself from the crime. And either way, if you're witnessing this event, you're culpable for it.
Yeah, if you're there just chilling and you help cover it up afterward. So, in any case, when Doreen failed to return home, large-scale search efforts were launched. In some ways, it was like Joanie's disappearance all over again. Among the searchers was none other than Teok Eastman himself, who was a member of a local search and rescue group. He, of course, did not reveal the location of Doreen's body and was not helpful in any way.
I think that really just goes back to pointing at the lack of remorse within Teok Eastman. I mean, we talked about that briefly earlier.
Yeah, he was someone who seems to have displayed a lack of remorse when it comes to his crimes. Now, also among the searchers were hundreds of volunteers from the community who desperately wanted to reunite Doreen with her devastated family. At that point, they were hoping she was still alive, and they searched high and low, eventually locating her bicycle along a beach access road concealed in some bushes. Still, at that point, the location of her body remained a mystery. Her mom told the media, quote, "It's the most helpless thing in the world. There's nothing anybody can do. It's like being stabbed with a knife every day." End quote. Fortunately, a witness had seen Doreen on the day of her disappearance. She'd been on her bike and had been talking to two men by a distinctive yellow MGB sports car. That led investigators to Eastman, the owner of a yellow MGB sports car. And when investigators interviewed him, he told them that Doreen was dead, murdered, and that it was all, conveniently for him, Mullen's fault. Naturally, investigators wanted to know where Doreen's body was. Eastman gave them several locations, all of which turned out to be unhelpful. Weeks later, two off-road motorcyclists would stumble upon Doreen's remains in some brush. Mullins, who at first denied any involvement in Doreen's murder, was arrested on kidnapping, rape, and aggravated murder charges after investigators found bloody clothing and a set of earphones just like Doreen's, which she'd had with her on her bike ride, at his home. Also worth mentioning is that following the murder, Mullins moved back home to California, where he was eventually tracked down and brought into custody. As for Eastman, he was charged with hindering prosecution, which essentially means that he withheld information regarding the crimes against Doreen from police. Reporting on Doreen's case describes the location where her body was found as being along a logging road near Highway 202. This location was 16 miles, or about 26 kilometers, away from the beach where Doreen had been murdered. Her body had been transported and concealed, possibly directly after her murder, by Eastman and Mullins in Eastman's car. Either that or one or both of them temporarily hid her body at the beach and returned to move it later. It's not publicly known for sure when exactly her body was moved. In any case, with Eastman testifying against him, Mullins eventually pleaded no contest to the murder and rape charges. As a result, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. It wasn't truly a life sentence, though, because he'd be eligible for parole after serving as few as 25 years. In any case, it was a very different story for Eastman. He was only ever charged with hindering prosecution. His sentence was a single year in prison, with 5 more suspended. With credit for time served, that amounted to him spending just 6 more months incarcerated after his conviction. After being freed, Eastman went on to commit more crimes. For example, in 1991, he placed a phone call to the mom of one of Doreen's friends. The girl by that point was away at college, and the day was her birthday. Now, the call was a collect call, and when Eastman spoke to the operator, he pretended to be the girl so that her mom would accept the collect call, which she did. And when the mom answered the phone, Eastman told her, quote, "Your daughter is next," end quote. When she asked him to repeat himself, he said, quote, "Your daughter is next, bitch," end quote. The woman recognized Eastman's voice because they had previously, before Doreen's murder and all that, been co-workers, and so she reported the threatening call to police. Well, this, of course, got Eastman in trouble with his probation officer and resulted in him being charged with harassment. And Eastman, apparently, loves to harass people. His middle name is Kelly, but he might as well just go ahead and change it to harassment. In fact, if you poke around on the internet in modern times, you can find ranting comments on crime blogs that appear to be made by Eastman, where he employs astonishingly poor spelling and grammar to threaten bloggers who dare to mention Doreen's murder. In any case, after Eastman was charged with harassment, a judge ordered him to serve the 5 suspended years of the sentence he'd received in relation to Doreen's murder. Because of parole policies related to prison overcrowding in Oregon at the time, he would not, however, end up serving much of that time. This was, unfortunately, out of the judge's hands. When it comes to Eastman as a potential suspect in Joanie's disappearance, he wasn't questioned in the early stages of the investigation. Perhaps this was because authorities genuinely had no reason to suspect him at the time, or perhaps it was because his dad was the sheriff of Clatsop County, that's the county where all this occurred, at the time. I don't know.
You can't deny that they're willing to overlook some of these procedural norms and treat this case with the credibility that it needs to be treated with.
Right. Now, again, to their credit, for the record, at the time, Teok Eastman was not a known murderer, and it may be the case that they genuinely didn't have a reason to suspect him. I don't know. I can only speculate. However, considering what we now know, that Eastman was involved in the murder of another local teenage girl, he presents obvious promise as a person of interest. And we know that he bothered Joanie's family at least one point. I say this because according to an article on Joanie's case published in the Daily Astorian, after Joanie's dad died of a heart attack in 1994, Eastman called Joanie's brother, Chuck, seemingly out of the blue to talk about, quote, what it was like to lose someone, end quote. By that time, it was already well known that Eastman had been involved in Doreen's murder, so of course Chuck found this suspicious. So suspicious that he recorded the conversation and turned the recording over to the sheriff's office. What, if anything, ever came of that, I don't know. And whether or not investigators consider Eastman a strong suspect in Joanie's killing, I also don't know. But I do know they have looked at him, at least as a suspect. Another theory is that Joanie may have been the victim of a serial killer. It's believed that there were several serial killers active in coastal Oregon during the 80s and 90s. Possible serial killer victims include, but are not limited to, Sheila Swanson and Melissa Sanders, who were best friends and 19 and 17 years old respectively in 1992. Sheila and Melissa vanished together from a coastal Oregon location, Beverly Beach State Park. Melissa and Sheila had gone there to camp with Melissa's family, but got bored and decided to hitchhike away. Their remains were discovered months later along a logging road. Their murders are still unsolved, although investigators have identified some potential suspects. One of them is a man named John Ackroyd. Not long after Melissa and Sheila's disappearance, he was arrested on charges of murdering a female jogger, Kay Turner, who he had abducted and murdered back in 1978. He was convicted of her murder and would spend the rest of his life in prison as a result. However, Kay was not the only victim who he'd killed. He'd also been responsible for the death of his 13-year-old stepdaughter, Rashonda Pickle, who'd gone missing in 1990. When finally charged with her death, he pleaded no contest, and 2 victims makes him a serial killer by the FBI's definition. However, he's suspected to have had more victims, very possibly including Sheila and Melissa. He was someone they knew from around town and would hang out with at a local restaurant. They had not, of course, known that he was a murderer. Ackroyd is a very compelling suspect in Melissa and Sheila's cases. Whether or not he could possibly have also been responsible for Joanie's disappearance is unknown. Her hometown is nearly a 3-hour drive up the coast from his, though, and I don't know if he was in the habit of going that way.
He's not as compelling as some of the people we've talked about.
I would consider him a lot more compelling if he had actually lived in Joanie's community. Now, another serial predator and suspected serial killer who authorities have publicly named as a potential suspect in Sheila and Melissa's murders is Bobby Jack Fowler. Fowler traveled frequently throughout the Pacific Northwest at large and Western Canada, committing crimes in both countries and various states, including Oregon. At least one of his victims was a teenage girl. Because of his frequent travel throughout the Pacific Northwest, he's an obvious potential person of interest in any case where a female victim vanishes or is murdered under mysterious circumstances in the area. I'll balance that, though, by saying that he appears to have sought out victims who engaged in high-risk activities such as hitchhiking. And to the best of my knowledge, Joanie did not hitchhike or engage in any risky activities at all. Therefore, in my opinion, the odds of Fowler being involved in her disappearance are likely pretty low. Whether or not Joanie may have been the victim of a serial killer remains unknown. Although the possibility can't be ruled out until we know for sure what happened to her, statistically speaking, it's far more likely that someone Joanie knew from her own community was responsible for her disappearance. Joanie's absence is still felt by the family members who have survived her and survived their grief. Not counted among the survivors are her parents, both of whom died at relatively young ages in 1994, 11 years after Joanie's disappearance. Joanie's sister, Becky, told the Daily Astorian that in a way, her parents had actually died in 1983 on the day of Joanie's disappearance. They'd never been the same afterward and had suffered, both mentally and physically, for the rest of their lives. Looking back, Becky recalls her sister's disappearance as a pivotal moment in her family's history. Quote, "There were no pictures after that. Holidays were forced. Mom put up the Christmas tree for the grandkids. But every year on February 24th, Joanie's birthday, my mom would cry. She'd say, 'It's my baby's birthday and I don't know where my baby is.'" End quote. Joanie's aunt, Aggie, also remembers the effect that Joanie's disappearance had on Joanie's mom, who was of course her sister. According to what she told the Daily Astorian, for years, Joanie's mom, Mary Jane, would frequently imagine that she'd glimpsed Joanie in passing, especially while driving, causing family members to make countless U-turns just to check. Unfortunately, it never was Joanie. In her final years, Mary Jane lost her sight, but her desperation remained. No longer able to see, she would insist that she'd heard Joanie's voice. And that was how she spent her final years, blindly navigating the town her daughter had disappeared from in perpetual search of her. She died of diabetes complications on the 11th anniversary of Joanie's disappearance. Her husband, Joanie's dad, Melvin, died within 2 months of his wife's death of heart failure. Their surviving children are still waiting for answers regarding their sister's disappearance. If you know anything about the disappearance or whereabouts of Joanie Hall, please call the Clatsop County Sheriff's Office at 503-325-2061 or email them at sheriff@clatsopcounty.gov. The Sheriff's Department personnel who were originally involved in this investigation 30-plus years ago are long since gone from the agency. And if you found this episode to be of special interest, you may want to check out our episode on the unsolved disappearance of Amanda Gallion. Like Joanie, Amanda was a teenage girl who vanished while walking. Her case isn't related to Joanie's, but they do bear some similarities. We aired our episode on Amanda's unsolved disappearance in September of 2023. You can scroll back to then in our feed to listen if you'd like.
That's all for this episode of Lasting Life. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check our website, lastinglifepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to sources we used to write it. While you're at, follow us on Insta at LSA Podcast and TikTok at Lasting Life Podcast. Episodes of Lasting Life air every Monday. See you then. If you think bringing unsolved cases like Joanie's to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Lasting Life and tell your friends to check us out too. We really appreciate it. Also, don't forget to check our merch store where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Doe Project. Lasting Life is a Studio 222 production. Research and writing for this episode is provided by you, Leah. Audio engineering, editing, and hot takes are provided by me, Scott.